So the US dollar has already been hyperinflated. It has no future.
Hmm.
The only reason it hasn't gone to zero already is two things: currency manipulation and the fact that the criminals have sequestered most of their funny money outside of the broader economy. So the consequence of that funny money explosion hasn't filtered through.
Hmm.
So the dollar is already dead. The criminals know this. And so this is why we're getting all of this talk now about, oh, let's introduce the SDR as a reserve currency. Well, of course, the SDR isn't even a currency at all. It's just a line of credit.
Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today, my guest is Mr. Jeff Nielson, co-founder and managing partner at Bullion Canada, an online precious metals educational community. Mr. Nielson is a longtime investor and researcher in precious metal sector and is passionate about sharing his expertise on global economics, markets, as well as geopolitical events. He has personally written hundreds of commentaries on the internet, as well as other video commentary on the alternative media world. Today he's going to sit down and share his take on what's happening globally, dealing with the markets, as well as his take on what's happening here in the United States, dealing with our political ordeal that's happening now. So, Jeff, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Hi, Mike. It's a pleasure to be a guest here.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me. I'm glad we were able to coordinate this time frame to sit down. I know you have a holiday there, so I appreciate you taking time to sit down with me. Looking forward to getting your take on a lot of things happening globally for the most part, whether it be with the precious metal sector, which is your expertise, as well as the whole banking crisis in Germany and so forth. But before we actually get into all those details, I typically start off with some Rethinking the Dollar questions. And the first one is, what comes to mind when Jeff Nielson hears the words Rethinking the Dollar?
Well, I have some very strong views on the monetary system in general and the US dollar in particular. And actually, it was about 3, 4 years ago, I wrote a commentary entitled Three Reasons Why the US Dollar is Already Worthless. So when I hear the phrase rethinking the dollar, it's in terms of rethinking that this currency has any value at all.
Fair enough. Now, before we actually, hit record button, we're talking about just the educational system and relearning and having to retrain ourselves on subjects such as this. So why do you think there's never been any type of push for financial education or monetary literacy, as I like to use the words, in our educational system to teach people things that are important, such as currencies and dollars and things like that?
Well, based on years of my own research, I am now firmly of the opinion that we live in a crime syndicate system. Our supposedly sovereign governments are not, in fact, the supreme authorities of our cultures, but they're, in fact, just the political lackeys of a crime syndicate that rules above them, which I've entitled the One Bank. And this is, of course, not just my own musing, but this is based on some research by a trio of Swiss academics. And they did some extensive computer modeling involving a massive data sample of more than 10 million actors, corporations, and individual entities. And the results of their, their computer model was that there was in other words, a single super entity that by itself controlled 40% of the entire global economy. And they pointed out that this entity was composed of approximately 144 corporate fronts, and 3/4 of these corporate fronts were financial institutions of one form or another. Excuse me. I'm getting over a flu bug here, so I might break up a little bit occasionally.
No problem. Let me know.
Get some water. Yeah, 3/4 of these fronts were financial institutions, and hence the title, the One Bank. So, of course, when you have this incredible amount of control, you can extend that control throughout other facets of society. So, for instance, I don't really consider our educational system to be an educational system. I consider it to be an indoctrination system.
Right.
And so, of course, this is how truths are hidden and propaganda is propagated, through creating this mythology in our education system and then expanding upon it through the corporate media, which is, of course, just another tentacle of this massive crime syndicate.
Right. Now, if you were asked, a question as far as like where does the world stand now or as I like to say, if you were at the podium, all cameras globally was tuned in to Jeff Nielson right now, and they were asked you, what is the global state of the economy address? What would you tell the viewers watching you right now?
Well, I owe a lot of my own understanding to a gentleman named John Williams of shadowstats.com. And it was about 12 years ago where he came up with this brilliant essay entitled The Hyperinflationary Depression. And the gist of the essay was that he pointed out how it was not simply possible, but likely that we could enter an economic scenario where parts of our economy were deflating in a deflationary crash, while most of the economy was hyperinflating. And the basis of this is that insolvent economies can't have a depression. You can only have a depression if you're solvent and healthy, and you have some savings and resources you can cannibalize to get you through the trough.
Mm-hmm.
So what Mr. Williams correctly assessed was that our economies are all insolvent. And so when this next collapse comes in the next few months or weeks or perhaps even days, these insolvent economies have no cushion to rely upon. So all they can do when the downturn hits and their tax revenues collapse with that downturn is print, and print some more. Mm. And of course, that's hyperinflation. Right. So we can see bad debts deflating in an implosion. We can see asset bubbles, some of them deflating, or at least relatively deflating. But the currencies have to be hyperinflated because that's the only way these bankrupt regimes can avoid declaring bankruptcy. Right. So you can't have a deflationary crash like we've heard from some commentators when you're dealing with nothing but a collection of insolvent economies.
Right. Now that leads into my, one of my other topics of the Federal Reserve and the fact that the mainstream media, every time I turn on a channel of some kind just to stay in tune with what's going on, you hear about someone saying the percentages now are really increasing. They're really going to raise in November. They're really going to raise December. They're really going to raise. So I've been hearing this for quite a while now. Apart from just that one hike last December, there's been nothing this is significant. That really, really will matter. What are your thoughts on that? Will they raise? Will they be able to? Does anybody really even care anymore, being that we're so far gone in a monetary matrix of confusion here? What are your thoughts about all this?
Well, I just laugh when I listen to this silliness because I dubbed B.S. Bernanke the boy who cried exit strategy in a commentary about 4 years ago. Because, I mean, you talk and talk and talk about doing something, and you never do it. You have no credibility. Well, that's the whole fable of the boy who cried wolf. Mm-hmm. You cry wolf over and over again, and eventually people stop listening. Well, of course, the absurdity here is we have the boy continuing to cry wolf over and over and over again, year after year, and yet we have these drones in the mainstream media continuing to treat every word as being complete the gospel, and it's absolute insanity. And of course, beyond this, what people have to do is they have to go back in time to 2008 and remember what was being said back then, and what Bernanke and all the central bank governors were saying, and all the heads of the other central banks, is that they were going to normalize interest rates immediately in 2009, not just a 0.25% here and there, take interest rates all the way back up to normal right away in 2009. Mm-hmm. And of course, that never even started, let alone happened. But then also, from 2009 through 2013, right to pretty much the point where he left the Federal Reserve, Bernanke was boasting about the wealth effect that he was creating with his money printing. Mm-hmm. Well, now here is the point. You can either ease back and taper and exit your extreme monetary policies, or you can allow them to run through their bubble cycle and get to where we are today. Well, the fact that Bernanke was bragging about the wealth effect he was creating was proof that he never intended to do an exit strategy, because you can't do both simultaneously. All right. Wow. He intended to create his so-called wealth effect, all the funny money printing and the illusionary wealth that results from it. And that means he was never serious about the exit strategy. So, of course, when his own contradictory words have proven that he was never, ever serious about doing this, who in their right mind would ever assign the slightest bit of credibility to this "we're going to raise interest rates" talks? And of course, it's the same with Yellen now. She's just an appendage extension of Bernanke. All right. Now, you mentioned the word credibility. At what point does the idea of credibility just become a laughing joke? I mean, because it's all basically based upon confidence.
the public's confidence in the central bank's ability to, keep things quote unquote normal. So how will credibility unwind and will confidence be completely lost, especially when it comes to the national currencies that these central banks tend to manage for the governments, or predominantly the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve note?
Well, I just saw something happen that I thought was really interesting over the last few days. And as the latest U.S. jobs report came out, and of course it was a disappointment. It was below expectations. It was a third month of falling numbers. Normally, the way the market reacts to economic bad news over the last year or so is the markets go up. And the reasoning behind this is, okay, well, gee, the U.S. economic news is bad, so the Federal Reserve won't raise interest rates, and that's good for markets. Of course, what we saw this last week is we had the bad economic news, and we had U.S. markets falling. Mm. And so what, to me, that signified is that the Federal Reserve was not even a factor. It's like you had bad economic news, so the markets go down, the Fed's irrelevant. Now, of course, that's not what the mainstream media would say. I mean, they came up with this ludicrous cock and bull story about how 3 consecutive months of declining job numbers strengthened the case for a rate hike. I mean, total idiocy. And I mean, this is the other way that we illustrate the lack of credibility of this institution is when we see the efforts of the mainstream media to try and inject credibility into it, and it's just ludicrous. It's perverse. And so I see the markets starting to decouple from this Federal Reserve nonsense, subject to the fact that, of course, the banking crime syndicate itself has extreme manipulatory control over the markets, and in any given day, they can cause the markets to go up and make it look like they're responding to the Fed. But in general terms, I see the Fed already losing credibility with markets.
All right. Now, you hinted at banking crime syndicate. Let's talk about, just the commercial banking, especially the whole ordeal here in the United States with Wells Fargo and the fake account scandals. Is that just an isolated event, or can that be a door opener to, our issues here with our banking sector, as far as the whole, insolvency and just the fact that banks seem to be struggling if they have to come up with all types of ways to make a profit? Is that Wells Fargo something that's going to be an isolated event, or can it spring into something a lot more, in your opinion?
Well, the strange thing here is, of course, what happened with Wells Fargo is an absolute outrage. Low-level bank employees simply stealing from their own clients. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing here is that the total amount involved in this serial crime is only in the millions of dollars. And yet it's drawn a huge outrage, and it's resonated quite a bit with the public. And yet what I have been writing about, month after month, year after year, are these same big banks committing crimes, not in the millions, not in the billions, but in the trillions of dollars. And they're committing these multi-trillion-dollar crimes, and nobody's paying attention. And then we see Wells Fargo get caught with this stupid multi-million-dollar crime, which is just an absolute lack of internal oversight. And I mean, if they weren't so arrogant and evil, they would have never allowed it to occur. And this multi-million-dollar crime could result in a much greater level of public awareness than all the trillions they've been stealing over the past several years. And in that respect, it's really, really funny.
Right. Now, and speaking of trillions, you use a lot of words that kind of just really just adds on to more of what I'm interested in hearing about now. Trillions. I think I it was this morning, a title of an article. I can't remember exactly, but it was Deutsche Bank is trying to convince the public that, their trillions in derivatives is not really a major risk for them type of thing. It was something around those lines. But talk about trillions. Now let's go to Deutsche Bank in Germany and the whole idea that, will the government bail out or will they bail in? How is the mess there with the trillions that they are entangled with the derivatives? How will all this fare out? And what's your long-term thoughts on how this will unravel?
Well, again, I sort of have two perspectives here. On the one hand, based on my paradigm of the one bank, Deutsche Bank is nothing but another tentacle. I mean, the Swiss research specifically names Deutsche Bank as one of the 144 tentacles of the one bank, mm-hmm. and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Bank of America and so on. All these big banks, they were named as tentacles. Mm-hmm. So this is the surreal part of this whole crisis idea, is you have this massive financial crime syndicate with all of these tentacles, and each tentacle, of course, itself is incredibly huge. But the idea that if any one tentacle is in trouble, that this is a threat to the system is ludicrous. And in fact, like what happened in 2008 with the Lehman Brothers crisis and all of the institutions that went under, is they were all just tentacles of the one bank as well. So there was never a threat to the system because this crime syndicate is capitalized with such an incredible mountains of funny money that it couldn't go under in something of that manner. So what they actually did was they deliberately sacrificed a few of the tentacles to create this supposed justification for bailouts. And so what took place in 2008 was some of the tentacles going under and the government bailing out those tentacles and the money from the bailouts going into the hands of other tentacles. So it's like trying to claim that your left hand was bankrupting your right hand. Well, it can't work that way. There's a single hole, and either the hole is insolvent or the hole is solvent. And so we had this whole farce of these, endangered banks, which were all part of a single hole, and it was all just a charade. So we're very likely to see the same thing transpire over the next upcoming months, except of course now, as you mentioned, it's no longer bailouts, it's bail-ins. And now, of course, that means that all privately held financial assets are potentially targeted. And so what we saw in 2008 could be, just a tiny version of what we see in 2016 or 2017. And the other thing people need to realize is that the official total of the bailouts in 2008, the hundreds of billions, that was just the tip of the iceberg. That was just the upfront money that the crime syndicate got from their blackmail. The majority of the blackmail payments came in the form of tax breaks and loss guarantees, and those were in the trillions of dollars. I've heard estimates of their value being up to 30 trillion. So the 600 billion of TARP money and the upfront money they got was just a tiny tip of the iceberg, and so it was so ludicrous to listen to the mainstream media crowing about these banks repaying their TARP money when they're getting trillions of dollars slipped to them, surreptitiously through other means.
Right. Now, if it was just a tip of the iceberg, then what's ahead then? If all that money, which to this point in our history, to my knowledge, as well as my awareness of all this, seems like a lot of money. Seems like, you talk trillions, billions. That's still a lot to try to wrap my mind around. So if that's the tip of the iceberg, then what lies ahead? Then what's coming?
Part of the problem in answering a question like that is the lack of transparency in the system. And of course, the Federal Reserve in particular has turned its entire operations completely opaque. We no longer have any idea who are buying U.S. treasuries. Of course, the Fed itself will not ever fully disclose its own activities. And the reason it won't do so is because even the massive amounts of official money printing it's engaged in is just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond this, there's this massive counterfeiting operation. And here people have to understand the mechanics of our monetary system. We have the Federal Reserve pretending that it's lending money at 0%. Now, understand there's no such thing as a 0% loan. You try to do that in your personal financial affairs, and the IRS will be all over you. They'll say that so-called 0% loan is a sham transaction. It's just a gift, and we're going to tax you on the basis that it's a gift. So this is what the Federal Reserve was doing. It was giving these big banks trillions of dollars in free money. That's phase one of the crime. Phase two is the systemic crime that's known as fractional reserve banking, where banks are allowed to lend out $35 for every dollar they hold in capital. So here's where the crime comes in. If you're lending to banks at 0%, and they can leverage every dollar they take in by a factor of 35 to 1, they can lend out 35 times what they take in and lend it out at 0% as well.
Wow.
So then you have one bank taking, say, $1 trillion, lends out 35 trillion to Bank B, another one of the tentacles of the one bank. That bank then can take that 35 trillion and lend it out at 0% by a factor of 35. All of a sudden you have $1 quadrillion being counterfeited by just the Federal Reserve and two of these tentacles. But of course, the one bank has dozens of tentacles. In other words, through the fraud of 0% lending and the fraud of fractional reserve banking, the crime syndicate can now counterfeit infinite quantities of funny money legally. Infinite. So, I mean, this is the whole point here. When you talk about how big is this, well, how big can you imagine?
Well, I hope you're enjoying today's interview thus far. I want to direct your attention to the subscribe button. If you're enjoying it, subscribe for more great interviews to come, as well as go over to facebook.com/rethinking the dollar and give me a like there. I share monetary news on a regular basis. Looking forward to bringing you more interviews. Back to this conversation.
Because, whatever number you can imagine, they could have printed 10 times that amount.
So you say infinite amounts of money, of counterfeit, just funny money. At one point, at some point, there has to be a limit before people wake up and through, i.e. inflation or something like that, to where they say, hey, something's wrong here. Why am I working so hard and I got 2 jobs, 3 jobs, whatever, I'm saving, I'm not getting ahead. Something is wrong. And then what does that look like, and how does the light come on for people to realize that of these two types of crimes of 0% and then infinite quality printing through fractional reserve banking? How does this? I mean, I'm lost for words right now.
Well, I mean, this is the whole thing. And once again, there's sort of two perspectives here. On the one hand, if you're a rational person and you're properly informed, you look at what we have at present and you think, well, how can it last one more day? It's insane. It's corrupt. It's gone so far beyond any possible element of rationality that it can't hold together for another second. On the other hand, we have the phenomenon known as cultural insanity. And a belief system takes hold within the populace as a whole, and because it's collectively shared, that belief system clings far beyond the bounds of rationality. And the obvious historical example is what's known as tulip mania. About 500 years ago in the Netherlands, the Dutch people developed this obsessive love for tulips, to the point they started trading them as a quasi-currency. And of course, this got so out of hand that they quickly stopped trading the flowers themselves, because of course the flowers would wilt and the money would be gone in a few days. And they actually began trading the tulip bulbs. Mm-hmm. And so we have this culture treating tulip bulbs as money, even though, of course, being a plant, it's literally something you grow on a tree. You can create it in infinite quantities. Yeah. And of course, that's the fact. Anytime you have a currency monetary system where the currency can be created in infinite quantities, you have an absurd system. But this was the Dutch system, and of course it went on to the point where at the peak of tulip mania, someone was able to purchase a house with one tulip bulb, and then of course that was the very last gasp of tulip mania, and then all of a sudden, somebody else tried to buy a house with a tulip bulb, and somebody shook their head and think, what am I doing? The transaction failed, and then of course the illusion gets shattered, and then it quickly implodes. Mm-hmm. But predicting how long that insanity will last is a fool's game, because you can't rationally predict the termination of insanity. So we have this cultural insanity where people have this ludicrous idea that what they have in their wallets actually has some value when it's just nothing but worthless paper. Mm-hmm. And what's it going to take to shatter that belief? It's going to take some dramatic shock. So it's not going to be a matter of people just looking at things on paper and thinking, well, this doesn't make sense, so I'm no longer going to accept this funny money as money. It's going to require some massive external shock, likely an economic shock, possibly a geopolitical shock as well. And then, only then will they start to challenge their belief system and start to think, well, what are we doing?
Right. Wow. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk about politics a little bit. Last night was the debate, and we spoke briefly about that prior to hitting record. And so, second debate, and it was just my take on it briefly. It was more of like a very heated, emotional battle amongst two ferocious competitors. Like Hillary, she did her normal spiel of trying to stick to her script and trying to stick to some main points, but she couldn't really do it because Donald speaks off the cuff. He just speaks from the top of his head, and it was always his version of truth, which forced her to have to come out of her script to try to defend herself. So it was back and forth, and it was very entertaining, I must admit, from beginning to end. I was well entertained, a lot of laughter. and just, it was interesting to see how it was Trump versus three people for the most part. Even he mentioned it, that the two moderators and Hillary Clinton, there was those three against him, and he took it like a champ, in my opinion. But what are your thoughts? You're outside of the United States, so you have a chance to look into what's going on and get a firsthand review as a spectator. What are your thoughts? Sorry,
Well,
on
of
Trump
course,
and Clinton. Where you at with that?
sure. Well, of course, going back to what I was saying before, it's my view that both these political parties are just puppet appendages of the one bank.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter whether it's the Republican or the Democrat; they both take their orders from the banksters.
Hmm.
So, in that respect, I looked at this as, of course, the crime syndicate is generally indifferent to who wins, but the pattern has been to alternate.
Hmm.
8 years Democrat, 8 years Republican, 8 years Democrat, 8 years Republican, along with their 8 year bubble and crash cycle. And so the way the game has been played previously is you stage a crash just as one regime is going out, and so they get fingered as the scapegoat. And then the next regime coming in is hailed as the white knight, even though they're the ones that were blamed for the crash previous to this. And you
Hmm.
just repeat it over and over again. So based on the pattern, it was supposed to be the Republicans' turn to sit in the throne. And so it was my operating belief that it was going to be Donald Trump who was going to be, manufactured as the next president of the U.S.
Hmm.
But of course, you look at that debate, and as you point out, there was no balance at all. It was totally biased, where the moderator was clearly taking sides,
Hmm.
and so the fix was in, and so this suggests a different complexion to the whole scenario, and I still don't see any strategic upside of having a Democrat incumbent sitting in the White House when we know there's going to be a crash coming,
Hmm.
because there's no way of blaming somebody else.
Hmm.
It was 8 years of Obama, and now it's going to be 4 or 8 years of Clinton, and that's going to be blamed, and it's going to be the incumbent who takes the heat. And that's been opposite to the previous pattern. So, I've developed some somewhat extreme alternative scenarios where Clinton gets elected, the crash gets staged shortly after she's elected. There's massive economic chaos in the U.S. because, of course, we're talking about a bankrupt economy going down into a depression recession, which it can't survive.
Hmm.
And then we get Donald Trump rising up and saying to Hillary Clinton, "You're fired," and simply seizing control of the U.S. government.
Wow.
And so I mean, this is about the only rational way I can see things playing out, because it just makes no sense at all to elect another Democrat when you have to stage a crash, because of course there's no profit to be made for the banking crime syndicate in keeping these bubbles propped up any longer.
Hmm.
They're already at ridiculous levels. I mean, it's not even supposed to be possible to have a bond bubble and a stock bubble at the same time. That's supposed to be absolutely impossible. So we've got these impossible bubbles, gigantic bubbles in bonds, in equities, in real estate. No profit to be made until you crash it, take everything down, reset it, and start the bubble and crash cycle again. So we know the crash is coming. It makes no sense to have a Democrat take the blame, because
Right.
that's their puppets, and they don't want their puppets to be so hated that the U.S. finally decides to do something radical and actually vote for somebody other than a Republican or a Democrat.
Right.
Because the general scenario throughout all the West's economies now is the crime syndicate owns the top two parties.
Yeah.
And so as long as the top two parties get elected, doesn't matter who it is, they control the government.
Yeah.
So of course, this is what they want to prevent in all the in other nations, is allowing third parties to get elected. In the U.S., of course, they want to prevent a third party from even getting off the ground.
Mm.
And so, electing Clinton, staging a crash with her in the White House, that would seem to be fertile soil for creating a third party, especially if the only alternative is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So, I like I said, I can only come up with extreme scenarios when I look at what's currently playing out.
Right. And that's the thing, like the fact that, you can look ahead and nothing really seems like it's a win-win for anyone overall, because as you mentioned, there's a crash coming. There's bubbles that need to pop, and there's readjusting to everything that needs to be done. So something has to happen. And then one thing I noticed during the debate was a deliberate question. I think it was by Anderson Cooper, in reference to the, just starting to beat the war drums. Russia, Syria, and they're attacking Aleppo, and they're killing people, and it's I forgot exactly how it was worded, but it kind of implied that America needs to step in, and what should we do? here, Hillary, you have the first question, and you answer the first question, and she's like, we need to. I wouldn't put troops on the ground, but I would definitely take a strong stance. We need some leverage over Russia. So now Russia is being painted as the boogeyman, the monster, and so I imagine that intertwined in all of this confusion is war. And so whether it be before the election, after the election, the way things seem to be heating up from what I'm seeing, as some people also mentioned, there may not necessarily be an election if, a mistake is made or an intentional situation that takes place in Syria. What are your thoughts on that? Is war an option or a possibility?
Well, here's where I've been a student myself and followed people who really know what they're talking about. People like Ron Paul and Paul Craig Roberts.
Mm-hmm.
And, Ron Paul, I think it was 3 years ago, wrote a commentary where the gist of the message was the U.S. Congress had just voted for World War III. And, that was basically when they handed the executive branch carte blanche to do whatever it wanted in terms of initiating war. And of course, that's totally unconstitutional in the way the U.S. system is supposed to operate. And then we've had Paul Craig Roberts, writing article after article about how everything that's been said about Russia is mythology and propaganda, that Russia has been totally blameless throughout. Of course, anybody who really is paying attention understands that the U.S. staged a coup in Ukraine. And, this was totally U.S. operation. They put some thugs in power. The thugs started to run wild, and Russia was forced to protect some of its own Russian nationals that were living within the borders of Ukraine. And of course, also, the propaganda machine talks about Russia annexing Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the people who lived in Crimea voted 95% in favor of being absorbed by Russia. How much support it has to be required before this is hailed as a liberation rather than an annexation.
Right.
So, the propaganda is totally at odds with the facts. And, serious people like Paul Craig Roberts have been saying this over and over again. And of course, Ron Paul as well. The U.S. is trying to create World War III. They're trying to paint Russia as the scapegoat. And of course, staging a war is a great cover for an economic crash. So this would be the one scenario where you could have a Democrat stay in power, have an economic collapse, but the collapse isn't blamed on the Democrats or the government. It's blamed on Russia. It's some external boogeyman.
Right.
I still think it would have made more strategic sense to have a Republican in power and still continue the alternation. But at least if you're staging this external crisis, a manufactured war, then you can blame everything on the war and the supposed boogeymen that supposedly created that war.
Yeah, right. So it seems like there's some options that they have already laid out, and they're going to pick and choose what's best for their own interests, and then we'll be victim of it, of course. As we wind down our conversation, I wanted to definitely touch on currencies and things like that. What are your thoughts about with the British pound? Are you a fan of the term currency war and things like that? And with the Brexit, pound over the last couple of days, taking a little dive, people losing purchasing power and things like that's been devalued. What are your thoughts with that? Is that a deliberate act, or is that just reflections of the market?
There's nothing more manipulated on the planet than currency valuations. The big banks have been convicted of serially manipulating all of the world's currencies going back to at least 2008. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's conspiracy fact. The criminal convicted of manipulating all the world's currencies. They manipulate the dollar up, they manipulate everything else down. So what we're seeing in the UK right now is pure theater. You have, of course, the corporate media saying with the Brexit vote, oh, well, this is the end of the world, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Their Chicken Little routine we see over and over again. So what do the currency manipulators do? They trash the pound to make the propaganda make sense. Oh, look at the media is saying that this is the end of the world, and look at the British pound, it's falling. The media must be right.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is how these criminals stage things. They create their propaganda script, and then they stage market manipulations to make the script look legitimate.
Yeah.
So what's the script here? Okay, so the obviously the crime syndicate doesn't want the UK to leave the EU fully, because that would encourage lots of other nations to defect and the EU would fall apart, and it was the crime syndicate that created the EU. So they couldn't stop the Brexit vote from being successful. So what they did instead is they went the opposite route. Oh, Brexit is the end of the world. Well, let's crash the value of the pound and frighten the British people. So over the upcoming months, they're going to be frightening them and frightening them and frightening them. Look at what this consequence of Brexit is. Look what that consequence is. Of course, all the consequences are just manipulation by the one bank.
Mm.
And eventually, they frighten the people so much that the politicians say, well, look, our people are so uh, uncertain about what we're doing. We're going to have to revisit this whole Brexit vote. And maybe we're just going to ignore it altogether. And we're just going to stay in the EU because that's what the people want.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is the way this crime syndicate operates. They pervert the will of the people by lying to them, staging these theatrical events in our markets and economies in order to create a belief system that supports what they want.
All right. Last question here, and then being that the show's entitled "Rethinking the Dollar," what, in your opinion, what does a crime syndicate want to do with the Federal Reserve note? Is it something they want to keep going as a global reserve currency, or are they tired of it and they're ready for something new themselves, in your opinion?
If they had their choice, they would continue with the status quo forever. But as I was talking about before, they've already hyperinflated the dollar. It's already been hyperinflated past tense. And of course, people have to understand that inflation is an increase in the supply of money. That's the correct economic definition. So, people who have seen even the official money printing, I use a chart all the time for the adjusted U.S. monetary base, and it's this vertical line.
Mm-hmm.
We have 80 years of the line going flat, and then we have the Bernanke helicopter drop.
Mm-hmm.
So that's hyperinflation. That's the mathematical representation of hyperinflation. So the U.S. dollar has already been hyperinflated. It has no future.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason it hasn't gone to zero already is two things: currency manipulation, and the fact that the criminals have sequestered most of their funny money outside of the broader economy. So the consequence of that funny money explosion hasn't filtered through.
Mm-hmm.
So the dollar is already dead. The criminals know this. And so this is why we're getting all of this talk now about, let's introduce the SDR as a reserve currency. Well, of course, the SDR isn't even a currency at all. It's just a line of credit.
Mm-hmm.
And this shows how incredibly perverted our system has become, where people are starting to talk about things that don't bear the slightest resemblance to a currency and simply calling them a currency.
Yeah.
And so, this would appear to be the plan of the banking crime syndicate to move out of one currency that, and it was, at one time it was a real currency that's been rendered totally worthless, and to replace it with something that's not even a currency at all. It's just this concept that they've created out of thin air, and the entire global economy is going to be based on this line of credit.
Yeah.
In a line of credit that's not backed by anything. So this is where we're going, from insanity to insanity squared.
Right. Now, how does gold and silver, quote unquote, historical sound money, how does that and what does that play in all of this stuff we talked about this, for all this craziness going on? What is that going to be good for, and how does that play into all this?
Well, precious metals are the canary in the coal mine, and it's because they are real money. So as monetary metals, their price should automatically reflect changes in the supply of money. So when Ben Bernanke quintupled the US monetary base, the price of gold and the price of silver had to quintuple along with that. Well, of course, it never did, because, of course, they're manipulated and held down by the banking crime syndicate. But the problem is that when you underprice anything, it is overconsumed. And in the case of a physical good, that means that you deplete inventories and you deplete stockpiles, and pretty soon there's nothing left, and the market implodes. And the only reason this hasn't already taken place with respect to precious metals is because our species had accumulated gigantic stockpiles of these metals over literally thousands of years. So they've had this huge imbalance in precious metals markets where they've been suppressed to ridiculously low prices for decades, and we've been burning through these stockpiles. Nobody knows exactly how big the stockpiles are. We just know that they're finite and they are being burned through at a rapid rate. So, a lot of extremely smart people expected this scenario to already have imploded several years ago, and I expected it myself.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't, and of course, that's just due to the uncertainty of not knowing how much stockpiles the crime syndicate had at their disposal originally. But it must implode, and the imbalance is getting worse. And so that means the speed with which we're approaching that implosion date continues to accelerate. Whether that's going to be tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now, I can't imagine that. But,
Yeah.
weeks, months, a couple of years, there's really no way of saying precisely.
Right. Wow. Jeff Nielson, I appreciate you sitting down with us on Rethinking the Dollar and sharing your take. Definitely was an interesting conversation. I definitely enjoyed it. Give the audience a chance to find out more of what you do and where you're located at for those that may not know who you are and things like that. How can it be a blessing to your work?
Well, I've got my home base, bullionbullscanada.com. I'm also a contributing writer for Sprott Money, which is a financial investment company up in Canada, which is actually one of the good guys. It's heavily involved in promoting gold and silver. And in fact, I contribute to their precious metals division, which does nothing but retail bullion, physical bullion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really happy to be working with that group. And I've also recently taken a position with stockhouse.com. And so I'm doing work there promoting small companies, junior miners, junior tech companies. These small businesses are the companies that really create jobs in our economies. They're the companies that really invent things. It's not the big corporations that do that. They just buy other companies out when they come across something good.
Yeah.
So I'm right now spending a lot of time promoting the good guys in our economy, the small businesses that need and deserve investor dollars, when in fact most of these dollars are flowing into the huge corporations, which are the oppressors of our system.
All right. Well, thank you for sitting down with us. I definitely look forward to staying in tune with your work and following more of what you have coming up. And we'll kind of see how everything unfolds, with the remainder of 2016, heading into 2017 with elections and the markets and things like that. So it's going to be an interesting ride, Jeff, I must admit. So I definitely look forward to continue to follow what you do and to staying in tune and to use you as my educational source like you've always been. So appreciate you.
Well, it's been great talking with you, and I'll be happy to come back anytime.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Well, this concludes my conversation today with Jeff Nielson from BullionBullsCanada.com. Hope you found our conversation to be informative as well as educational. Scroll down below, leave us a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on this interview, as well as if you're new to RTD. Click the subscribe button for more RTD news interviews, as well as monetary news updates. Look forward to bringing you more interviews. Until we meet again, thanks.